Let me ask you something. Have you ever finished reading a psychology book, closed it, and realized you understand the concepts, but you haven't changed at all? You were there. You were focused. You highlighted the important parts. But the moment you walked away from the material, you were still the same person with the same patterns, the same blind spots, the same unconscious behaviors. Here's the truth no one tells you about learning. Most people don't transform because they're not engaging with dangerous ideas. They stay safe. They learn about psychology instead of psychologically transforming. They study concepts instead of confronting themselves. But Carl Jung, the legendary Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, he discovered something that can compress years of personal growth into weeks, a method so powerful it can fundamentally restructure who you are. But Jung issued a stark warning. The confrontation with the unconscious can lead to madness if not handled carefully. So why did Jung call his method dangerous? Because it doesn't just fill your head with information. It forces you to face the parts of yourself you've been running from your entire life. And that confrontation, that's not comfortable. It's not safe, but it's the fastest path to real transformation you've never considered. Your brain doesn't store facts about psychology. It stores psychological experiences. And unless you learn how to study in a way that creates those experiences, you'll keep reading without changing, learning without growing, accumulating knowledge without wisdom. But that stops now, because I'm going to show you Jung's exact method, the one that made him integrate more psychological insight in 2 years than most people do in 2 decades. Not through memorization, not through safe academic study, but through active confrontation with the unconscious mind. This works for anyone tired of intellectual understanding that doesn't translate to real-world transformation. If you stay with me until the end, you won't just learn about Jung's psychology, you'll experience it. And it all starts with this truth. The brain doesn't remember what you study safely. It remembers what you encounter dangerously. The problem with safe learning. Let me tell you what no one told me when I was drowning in psychology textbooks. I could explain cognitive biases, personality theories, and developmental stages. I could write papers about the unconscious. But I was completely unconscious of my own psychological patterns. I was performing the act of learning psychology without actually becoming more psychological. I was great at recognizing concepts in books, but terrible at recognizing them in myself. And those two are not the same skill. Recognition says, "Oh yeah, I've read about projection." Self-awareness says, "I'm projecting my insecurities onto this person right now." And if you're not training self-awareness, you're not really learning psychology, you're just memorizing it. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. True psychological learning isn't about accumulating information. It's about collapsing the distance between knowledge and self-knowledge. Most people can read about the shadow for years without ever meeting their own shadow. They can study archetypes without recognizing them in their daily life. Why does this happen? Because conventional learning keeps us in our intellectual comfort zones. We absorb ideas that make us feel smart without challenging who we are. We learn about the psyche instead of learning from our psyche. Jung called this intellectual knowing, knowledge that sits on the surface like oil on water, never mixing with the deeper layers of actual experience. It's safe, it's comfortable, and it's completely useless for real transformation. The problem with safe psychological learning is that it's slow psychological learning. When you only engage with ideas that don't threaten your self-image, you can spend decades accumulating psychological concepts without ever psychologically evolving. But Jung discovered another way, a way to learn not just intellectually but experientially, a way to compress the usual decades of gradual self-awareness into an intense period of direct confrontation with your unconscious patterns. That's his dangerous method. And here's why it works so fast. Jung's dangerous method revealed. Jung discovered his accelerated learning method during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period between 1913 and 1916 where he nearly lost his mind and found his genius. After breaking with Freud, Jung found himself in uncharted psychological territory. Instead of retreating to the safety of established theories, he did something radical. He turned inward and began actively engaging with his own unconscious mind. But this wasn't passive self-reflection. Jung wasn't just thinking about his psyche. He was diving into it headfirst through what he called active imagination. He recorded his dreams obsessively. He dialogued with the figures that appeared in his fantasies. He drew, sculpted, and even built stone towers to give form to the images erupting from his unconscious. And here's the crucial part. Jung didn't just observe these experiences, he participated in them. He argued with his inner figures. He asked them questions. He let them challenge his conscious assumptions. He made the unconscious conscious through direct engagement, not academic study. What Jung discovered through this process revolutionized psychology. The collective unconscious, archetypes, the individuation process. But more importantly for our purposes, he discovered a method of learning that was exponentially faster than traditional approaches. Here's why Jung's method works so fast. First, it bypasses intellectual defenses. When you encounter a psychological truth that threatens your ego, your mind immediately tries to rationalize it away. But when you actively seek out these uncomfortable truths, when you go hunting for your blind spots, you're forced to grapple with them directly. Second, it creates emotional engagement. Jung understood that we only truly integrate psychological insights that move us emotionally. Information that leaves us unmoved gets forgotten, but knowledge that stirs up fear, resistance, or profound recognition gets burned into our neural pathways. Third, it forces integration. When you encounter evidence that contradicts your self-image, you have three choices: dismiss the evidence, dismiss your self-image, or find a way to integrate both into a more complex self-understanding. The third option, integration, is where real growth happens. And it happens fast because the psychological tension demands resolution. But Jung was brutally honest about the risks. In his autobiography, he wrote, "It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious, and at first swamped me." Notice that word, swamped. Jung's method was so powerful that it nearly overwhelmed him. He experienced periods where he questioned his sanity. He felt isolated from colleagues who couldn't understand what he was going through. At times, he wondered if he was descending into madness. But he also recognized that this confrontation with uncomfortable psychological truths was the only way to genuine self-knowledge. As he put it, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So how do you apply Jung's dangerous method to your own psychological learning? How do you study psychology in a way that actually transforms your psychology? The shadow mapping method. Forget highlighting passages about the shadow. Start by mapping your own shadow. Here's what I mean. Jung's first dangerous technique was shadow work, actively seeking out the parts of yourself you'd rather not acknowledge. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding their shadow. Jung learned to hunt it down. Here's how you do it. Every time you have a strong emotional reaction to someone else's behavior, write it down. What specifically triggered you? What did you criticize? What made you angry or disgusted? Because here's Jung's insight. What you criticize most harshly in others is often exactly what you haven't integrated in yourself. Your judgments are a map to your shadow. Don't just read about projection. Catch yourself projecting. Don't just study psychological defenses. Notice when you're being defensive. Don't memorize the definition of denial. Recognize when you're in denial. This isn't comfortable. The first time I really applied this method, I realized I was criticizing people for being attention-seeking, while desperately craving attention myself. I was judging others for being emotionally unstable, while refusing to acknowledge my own emotional volatility. It sucked. It was humbling. But it worked faster than any textbook because I wasn't learning about psychology. I was experiencing psychological revelation in real time. Here's your first dangerous assignment. For 1 week, keep a triggered journal. Every strong reaction, write it down. Then ask, how might this be true about me? Don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it. Sit with the discomfort. Because that discomfort, that's your shadow trying to become conscious. And when you integrate shadow material, you don't just understand psychology better, you become more psychologically whole. the character fusion technique. But Jung went further than shadow work. He didn't just study his psychological patterns, he embodied them. He gave voices to his inner complexes and learned from them directly. Here's how you apply this. Instead of reading about psychological concepts, become them. Don't say the persona is a social mask. Say, I am wearing my professional persona right now, and I can feel how it's both protecting me and limiting me. When you're learning about psychological defense mechanisms, don't memorize definitions. Catch yourself using them. I'm intellectualizing right now because this emotion feels too threatening. I'm projecting my anxiety onto this situation. This isn't role-playing. It's psychological archaeology. You're excavating your own psyche in real time, using Jung's concepts as tools for self-discovery rather than academic knowledge. The active imagination protocol. Now here's where Jung's method gets truly dangerous. Active imagination. This is the technique that nearly drove Jung to madness and gave him his greatest insights. Active imagination isn't visualization or positive thinking. It's a deliberate dialogue with your unconscious mind. Jung would enter a state between waking and sleeping, allow images and figures to emerge spontaneously, and then interact with them directly. But you don't need to go as deep as Jung did. Here's a safer version you can start with today. The inner counsel method. Before making any important decision, don't just think about it logically. Consult your inner counsel, the different voices and perspectives within your psyche. What does your inner critic say? What does your inner child want? What does your inner wise person advise? Don't just think about these perspectives, actually dialogue with them. Write out conversations, ask questions, let them argue with each other. This sounds weird until you try it, because suddenly you're not just using one narrow slice of your intelligence, you're accessing the full spectrum of your psychological resources. The dream dialogue technique. Instead of just recording dreams, engage with them. If you dream about being chased, don't just analyze what it might mean. Have a conversation with the pursuer. What does it want? What is it trying to tell you? Jung discovered that dream figures often contain wisdom that our conscious mind can't access. But you have to engage with them actively, not just interpret them academically. The emotion integration process. When you feel a strong emotion, anger, fear, sadness, don't just label it or manage it. Dialogue with it. Anger, what are you trying to protect? What boundary has been crossed? What do you need me to understand? This isn't therapy, it's applied Jungian psychology. You're using emotional states as information sources rather than problems to solve. The amplification method. Jung had another technique that compressed learning. Amplification. Instead of studying concepts in isolation, he connected them to mythology, literature, art, and personal experience. Here's how this accelerates psychological learning. When you connect a psychological concept to multiple contexts, you're not just memorizing it, you're weaving it into the fabric of your understanding. Don't just read about archetypes, find them everywhere. Notice the hero's journey in movies, books, and your own life transitions. Recognize the great mother in nurturing figures, protective instincts, and smothering behaviors. Spot the trickster in comedians, rebels, and your own tendency to avoid responsibility through humor. The pattern recognition protocol. For every psychological concept you encounter, find 3 examples, one from mythology or literature, one from current events or popular culture, and one from your own life. This isn't busy work, it's neural network construction. You're creating multiple pathways to the same insight, which means faster recall and deeper understanding. The symptom translation technique. Instead of just learning about psychological symptoms, translate them into lived experience. Depression isn't just persistent sadness, it's the feeling of being underwater while everyone else breathes easily. Anxiety isn't just excessive worry. It's your nervous system treating everyday situations like saber-toothed tiger attacks. When you translate abstract concepts into visceral metaphors, your brain doesn't just store information, it stores experience. The integration challenge. Here's where Jung's method gets dangerous. Integration. It's one thing to recognize psychological patterns. It's another thing to actually integrate them into a more complex, authentic version of yourself. Integration means you can't go back to your old, simpler self-image. You have to hold contradictions. You have to acknowledge that you're both generous and selfish, both wise and foolish, both loving and destructive. This is psychologically destabilizing. Your ego wants simple, consistent stories about who you are. Integration forces you to embrace paradox, and that can trigger what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period where your old identity dies before your new one is fully born. Signs you're pushing integration too fast. Persistent identity. Confusion lasting more than a few weeks. Loss of connection to previously meaningful relationships or activities overwhelming. Anxiety or depression feeling like you don't know who you are anymore. If you experience these symptoms, slow down. Integration takes time. You can't rush psychological maturation any more than you can rush physical healing. Safe integration practices. Journal about your discoveries without immediately acting on them. Find a therapist familiar with depth psychology. Connect with others on similar journeys. Maintain grounding practices. Exercise. Nature, creative activities. Remember that psychological growth is a lifelong process, not a sprint. The courage to become whole. Jung's dangerous method teaches us that real psychological learning isn't about accumulating knowledge, it's about accumulating courage. The courage to see yourself clearly, the courage to engage with your unconscious patterns, the courage to become whole rather than just educated. This method is dangerous precisely because it works. When you learn psychology through direct confrontation with your psyche, you don't just understand concepts, you transform. And transformation, by definition, means that parts of your old self must die so your authentic self can be born. The fastest psychological learners aren't the safest ones. They're not the ones who stick to academic study or avoid uncomfortable self-examination. They're the ones brave enough to burn illusions in order to see psychological truth. But remember Jung's warning. This path isn't for everyone, and it's not something to approach recklessly. The same process that can forge wisdom can also fragment identity if pushed too hard or too fast. As Jung wrote in his Red Book, "The way is not straight, but appears to go round in circles. You will reach your goal by roundabout ways. You cannot avoid the detours. They belong to your way." The question isn't whether Jung's dangerous method will challenge you, it will. The question is whether you're ready to trade psychological comfort for psychological growth, safety for authenticity, the familiar for the transformative. If you are, then you're ready to learn psychology faster than you ever thought possible. But you're also ready for a journey that will change not just what you know about the psyche, but how you experience your own psychological reality. And perhaps that's the most dangerous lesson of all. True psychological learning isn't about understanding the mind. It's about becoming the kind of person who can navigate the depths of consciousness wisely, courageously, and in service of wholeness. Your unconscious is waiting. The only question is, are you brave enough to meet it?